Imagine waking up tomorrow and your money is worthless. Not just your savings and your salary, your rent, your food budget, gone. The numbers are still in your bank account, but they hold no meaning. A loaf of bread costs what your car was worth last week. Your paycheck can't buy dinner. Everything you worked for, every dollar you saved, every plan you made, erased overnight. This isn't science fiction. This isn't some dystopian fantasy. This has happened dozens of times throughout history, to millions of people just like you. From Weimar Germany to Zimbabwe, from ancient Rome to modern Venezuela, the pattern repeats with terrifying consistency. And every single time, the same question separates survivors from victims. When money dies, what actually holds value? History has answered that question in blood, sweat, and desperation. And if you're paying attention, it's answering it right now. Let's start with the uncomfortable truth that most people never want to hear. Money is not real. It's not solid. It's not permanent. Money is collective belief, nothing more, nothing less. It's a shared hallucination that only works as long as everyone agrees to keep dreaming. And when that agreement breaks, the illusion shatters instantly. There are three main ways this happens, and all of them have destroyed economies throughout history. The first is hyperinflation, when governments print so much money that it becomes worthless. This isn't a gradual decline, it's a death spiral. Prices don't just rise, they explode. What cost $1 today costs 10 tomorrow, 100 next week, 1,000 next month. Your salary arrives already obsolete. Savings evaporate before you can spend them. And the government, desperate to keep functioning, just prints more, making the problem worse with every new bill that rolls off the press. The second is the collapse of trust. Money only works because people believe in it. But that belief is fragile. When a government defaults on debt, when banks freeze accounts, when a war destroys infrastructure, people stop believing. And once trust is gone, no amount of printing can bring it back. The currency doesn't just lose value, it loses meaning. People refuse to accept it. Merchants demand something else. And suddenly, that paper in your wallet is just paper. The third is war. When nations fight, economies break. Supply chains collapse, production halts. Governments seize assets and print currency to fund armies. Wartime economies are survival economies. And in survival mode, fancy paper promises mean nothing. What matters is what you can eat, what you can trade, and what you can defend. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. In Germany during the early 1920s, the government was crushed by war reparations from World War I. Unable to pay in gold or goods, they did what desperate governments always do. They printed money. At first it seemed manageable, then it accelerated. Prices began doubling every few days. Workers were paid twice a day because their morning wages would be worthless by evening. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 cost 200 billion marks by November. People carried money in wheelbarrows, not because they were rich, but because it took that much paper just to buy groceries. Life savings, pensions, bonds, all of it turned to dust. The middle class was obliterated overnight. And here's the part that should terrify you. The people who suffered most weren't criminals or failures. They were responsible citizens who had done everything right. They saved money, trusted their banks, believed in their government, and they lost everything because they believed paper was safety. So when money dies, what survives? History has tested this question over and over, in every culture, every continent, every century, and the answers are brutally consistent. First, gold and silver. For thousands of years, precious metals have been humanity's backup plan. When currencies collapse, people flee to metals because they can't be printed, can't be inflated, and can't be decreed into existence by politicians. Gold doesn't care about your government's promises. It doesn't lose value because someone signs a piece of paper. In Weimar Germany, while marks became toilet paper, gold retained its purchasing power. Those who had converted their savings into metal before the collapse didn't just survive, they thrived. They bought property, businesses, and land from desperate people selling for anything real. Metals are the oldest form of wealth preservation because they've outlasted every empire that ever tried to replace them. Second, land. You can print money, but you can't print soil. Land produces food, provides shelter, and holds intrinsic value because it meets fundamental human needs. During hyperinflation in Zimbabwe in the 2000s, Currency became so worthless that people stopped using it entirely. But land still mattered. Farmers who owned property could grow food, trade it, and survive independently of the collapsing financial system. When money fails, the people who control production, who can grow, build, or create, become the new wealthy class. Third, food. In every collapse, food becomes currency. It's immediate, it's necessary, and it cannot be faked. During the Soviet collapse in the 1990s, rubles were nearly worthless. But a sack of potatoes could buy what paper could not. In Venezuela's modern crisis, families with access to food had leverage that no amount of bolivars could provide. Hunger doesn't negotiate. When money dies, the person with a stockpile of rice, canned goods, or livestock has more practical wealth than someone with a bank account full of zeros. Fourth, skills and networks. This is the asset most people overlook. When systems collapse, value shifts to those who can produce, fix, heal, or trade. The mechanic who can repair engines, the doctor who can treat illness, the carpenter who can build shelter. These people have something no inflation can destroy, the ability to create value. And just as important are networks, black markets, barter systems, communities of trust. In every collapse, informal economies emerge. Those connected to these networks survive. Those isolated and dependent on the old system do not. And finally, belief systems. Religion, ideology, community identity. These become anchors when everything else falls apart. In the chaos of Weimar Germany, people clung to churches, political movements, and social groups that provided meaning and mutual support. When money fails, humans still need something to believe in, something to organize around. Faith doesn't buy bread directly, but it builds the networks and the resilience that allow survival when institutions crumble. Let's walk through the wreckage and see what the survivors actually did. Start with Rome. For centuries, the Roman denarius was one of the most trusted currencies in the world. But emperors, desperate to fund wars and corruption, began debasing it, reducing the silver content and replacing it with cheap metals. At first, no one noticed. Then trust collapsed. Merchants refused to accept debased coins. Soldiers demanded payment in goods instead of currency. Inflation spiraled. The economy fragmented into local barter systems. And when Rome finally fell, it wasn't just the empire that died. It was the illusion that imperial currency could last forever. The people who survived were landowners, farmers, and those who had never trusted the emperor's promises in the first place. Fast forward to Weimar Germany. We've already talked about the scale of the collapse, but let's talk about the survivors. The winners were those who borrowed heavily before hyperinflation hit and paid back their debts with worthless currency. They were the ones who converted paper money into real assets, property, factories, foreign currency, before the collapse accelerated. There's a famous story of a German homeowner who took out a mortgage in marks, watched inflation destroy the value of the debt, and then paid off the entire loan with what amounted to pocket change. Meanwhile, savers, the responsible, prudent citizens, were destroyed. Their pensions vanished. Their bonds became waste paper. The lesson was cruel but clear. In hyperinflation, debtors win and savers lose. In Zimbabwe during the 2000s, the government printed currency so recklessly that inflation reached 89.7 sextillion% per year. Sextillion. The Zimbabwean dollar became a global punchline. You could buy a $100 trillion note as a souvenir. But for the people living through it, this wasn't funny. It was catastrophic. Families watched their life savings become worthless overnight. Salaries couldn't buy a single meal. The formal economy collapsed entirely, and people turned to the black market, to US dollars to barter. Those with access to foreign currency, to land, or to goods they could trade survived. Everyone else was crushed. And then there's Venezuela. In the 2010s, socialist policies combined with corruption and collapsing oil prices created a perfect storm. The bolivar went into free fall. Inflation hit over 1,000,000%. ATMs became useless because the maximum withdrawal couldn't buy a cup of coffee. People began weighing cash instead of counting it because the numbers were meaningless. Families fled the country by the millions. Those who stayed survived on remittances from abroad, on black market trading, and on whatever food they could grow or barter. The middle class vanished, and the government, rather than admit failure, just kept printing. Do you see it yet? The pattern is undeniable. Whenever money dies, trust doesn't disappear. It just shifts somewhere else. Sometimes to gold and silver, sometimes to land and food, sometimes to skills and black markets, sometimes to foreign currencies or belief systems. But it always shifts, and the people who recognize that shift early are the ones who survive. The governments always deny it. The experts always say this time is different. The institutions always insist the system is sound. And every single time they are wrong, because the system isn't sound. It's built on trust, and trust once broken cannot be repaired with more promises. Here's the part that should keep you awake at night. This pattern hasn't stopped. It's happening right now. In Lebanon, banks froze accounts and the currency collapsed. In Turkey, inflation is destroying purchasing power while the government insists everything is fine. In Argentina, people have lived through so many currency crises that they instinctively convert pesos to dollars the moment they're paid. Even in the United States, the money supply has exploded. Debt has reached unfathomable levels, and trust in institutions is eroding. The warning signs are always the same. Excessive printing, unsustainable debt, political instability, loss of confidence, and every time, the people who suffer most are the ones who believe the system would protect them. So here's the lesson history teaches, over and over. In every language, every century, every culture, money is only as strong as the belief behind it. When that belief vanishes, and it always does eventually, the real currency becomes what you can grow, build, trade, or convince others to trust. This isn't about pessimism. It's about pattern recognition. It's about understanding that the rules of survival don't change just because we have smartphones and digital banking. The fundamentals remain. Real assets outlast paper promises. Skills outlast salaries. Community outlasts institutions. You don't have to become a doomsday prepper to learn from this. You just have to understand that trust is fragile. Systems are temporary. And the things that hold value when everything collapses are the same things that have always held value. Land. Metal, food, skills, and human connection. History doesn't just tell us what happened, it warns us of what can happen again. And the people who ignore those warnings are always the ones left holding worthless paper, wondering how they didn't see it coming. If this changed how you see money, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.